Welcome to our third night in our series looking at the rise of the far right and the solutions that Islam proposes to be able to deal with this challenge locally here to Britain and also the rise of the far right across the world. So far in our first two discussions, we have looked at some of the primary arguments that come from the far right. And we've mentioned three in particular. The first was that there exists such a thing as races, that humanity can be divided into multiple races depending on where you have been born, to whom you have been born, and there is a hierarchy amongst these races. Some are stronger, some are more intelligent, some are more prone to violence, and as such, because certain races are better than others, then the one that is inherently better has some standing above the one which is inherently lesser and flawed. From this comes the second argument, which we looked at yesterday, was that when there is this concept of races, that there are these different groupings within humanity, some inherently better than the other, when these races mix, it will be the downfall of a society or a civilization. And as a result of this, the white supremacist wishes to create what is known as an ethno-state, a country that has one type of ethnicity, such as being white only. Because the moment white mixes with black, or white mixes with red, or white mixes with brown, those other colors would bring down that society through its inherent desire for violence, for being less intelligent, for being a community that cannot organize themselves, as well as a white race. And so we started looking at some of the arguments for this, and then we began to answer some of them. And we mentioned, for example, that there is this idea that there is a pure race, and these people need to be identified. And such, when they can be identified, we need to ensure that we have a means, either through violence or a means through policy, to be able to remove those people who don't truly belong to Britain. And that is something that has been proposed by UKIP. And we mentioned that if you look at the difference between this theory and the Islamic theory of how people are supposed to live together, the white supremacist who wants an ethno-state wants to remove all people, and especially Muslims, from a country so that it is white only. Islam, however, considers that Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, all sects, all faiths must live alongside one another, because without living alongside one another, we cannot complete each other. Only when we learn from each other, only when we begin to dialogue, only when we see each other through the beauty of humanity and seeing how we can overcome these challenges mutually, does society truly prosper and truly grow. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states within the Quran that you are supposed to be one community. But the reason as to why He has given you these differences amongst yourselves is not for hierarchy and rivalry, لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِيمَا آتَاكُمْ, to test you by virtue of what Allah has given to you. This is the vision that Islam has. And the third thing that we spoke about yesterday was that the white supremacist believes that the Muslim has to give up either the entirety of their faith or part of their faith. And even this is mentioned in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks, do you believe in part of the book and then reject and do kufr of the other part of the book? Is there something that you wish to replace your Islam with? Is there something, a religion, a sect out there which is better than the one that you follow? Is there something more holistic that it's going to provide you with if you now give up part of your religion? And so the Muslim will never do this, no matter how much the supremacist wants this to take place. Tonight, inshallah, we're going to go into a new discussion. And we're going to ask three questions. Number one, how does a society become discontented? How does a society become unhappy with its own communities and ultimately becomes a means of turning on each other? Number one. Number two, we're going to ask, how is it that white supremacists and the far right has been mainstreamed in the history of Britain? And we will look, for example, at the story of the Irish when they moved in the 1800s, the Jews who moved in the aftermath of the First World War, and then we will come to the BNP and to UKIP and understanding the way in which these things have become mainstream thinking in the world that we live in today, specifically in Britain. And then lastly, we will ask the question, what is an Islamic view of integration? Now that we believe that all faiths, all sects should live alongside each other so they can complete one another, they can learn from one another, they can better one another. As a result of this, how then do we successfully integrate ourselves into society? What is the Islamic social model of integration of communities, of faiths, of sects that may not see eye to eye? If we can understand this, then tomorrow we can go further into our discussion specifically on how Islam now tackles the far right movement. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Yesterday, we stated that we needed to understand the differences between fascism, between illiberalism or an illiberal democracy, and between conservatism. All of these three things are very nuanced. They're not the same thing. And we stated that by calling out fascism for what it is and not being afraid to call people fascists, if their views truly do fall into the realm of fascism, is one way to be able to defeat this issue. Why? Because people are very afraid of fascism. Racism is one thing, fascism is another, which we're going to be touching on tonight, the differences between the two. When the far right want an ethno-state and want to remove all Muslims, all Jews, all immigrants from the country in order to create a white-only country, we have to understand that the very source of this is anti-democracy. This is a second way of responding to the issue of the ethno-state. We believe here in the West in democracy, correct? We're not like Al Saud, who believe that you can just inherit and have a king after another king, irrespective of how stupid he is, irrespective of how much he murders people. Here in the West, they believe in democracy. The bedrock of democracy is what? The bedrock of democracy is pluralism, that allows a multiplicity of thought, allows you to be able to stand up for what you believe, campaign for what you believe, so long as it's within the framework of the law, to also allow you, and all of us in this room can stand for government, for local councillor, for any office within the land. And the idea of democracy is to allow people to stand up and put their argument forward in a melting pot. I will argue my position, you will argue your position. And then we go to the world, we go to the country, we go to the people, and we invite their votes. Vote for me because my argument is better. My economic plan is better. My ecological plan is better. And whoever wins, wins. When the ethno-state wants to come about, when those people who want to remove people from within a country, this is essentially anti-plural, anti-democratic. And it is important to note that, because when we say that they are anti-democratic, what they want is to remove people by force who do not align with their thinking, who challenge their thinking. This is the very definition of fascism. When you argue against someone who wants an ethno-state and to remove, what you're actually saying is they are anti-democratic. If they are anti-democratic, they don't really have Western values. This is the way to be able to defeat these individuals. We are being told we don't have Western values, whatever those are. But you as the white supremacists don't have Western values. Why? Because you want to remove people from a democracy where a democracy essentially allows people to come and debate, and whoever is the best presenter of their argument wins their argument at the ballot box. Now, having understood that this is the way in which society is shifting, we're going back towards a place in which there is authoritarianism at the core of society. There is hatred at the core of society, that we are removing the values that the West claims to have grown up on, claims to be so superior on. This raises the question, how have we got here? And that allows us to ask our first question tonight. How and why does a society become so discontented that it ends up turning on one another? That I, as one group, hate you so much that I'm willing to want to kick you out of a country. How does that happen? Now here, sociologists, and specifically Muslim sociologists, have different opinions as to how to start with this view. Do we start from a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach? Meaning, do we understand things from the way in which government policy starts and it trickles down? Do we look at the way in which a foundation of people actually live and then we go up to the way it goes towards government? Islam considers both to be valid. However, for tonight, I am going to be looking at the way in which individuals lose their sense of thinking, how people are psychologically abused and easily manipulated, and that through a numerous amount of individuals ends up being a collective thought amongst people. I mentioned to you in previous nights, I wish for all of you to have pens and pads, to have your phones out so that you can make notes. At this point, again, I encourage you and invite you to have your phones out, make notes, because here I'm going to give you ayat of the Quran, which is going to show you the way in which psychology is mentioned within the Quran, to show you how individuals can easily be manipulated. And when they are so weak-willed and they don't know where to get their morals and their values from, then they can easily be manipulated from outside sources. How does discontent happen within a society? It starts from the individual. Individuals who might be weak-willed, or individuals who don't know how to rationalize certain issues, when they get manipulated, they can be manipulated as a collective, and their hatred and misunderstanding becomes weaponized. This is the way in which the far right operates. They prey on individuals that are weak in education, weak in understanding, and who can easily be turned through hatred. The Quran has 3 verses that I'm going to present more, but I'm only going to present 3 for the sake of brevity, that talks about the psychology of an individual and how they become so manipulated and what actually happens to them as individuals. If you have your Quran apps, you're welcome to open the Quran with me and we can read the verses together, inshallah. The first verse comes to us from chapter number 20 of the Holy Quran, verse number 124. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about certain individuals and the way in which their life would be, that they will live a horrible life. Their life will be a difficult life. And there is a reason as to why they will end up living a difficult life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the first verse, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, chapter number 20, Surah Taha, verse number 124. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا. Whoever disregards my remembrance will have a wretched life. Here, note what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. Not the one who turns away from me, the one who turns away from my remembrance. It's a subtle difference. The one who turns away from Allah altogether may be an atheist. I don't believe in God altogether. It doesn't say that. The one who turns away from the remembrance of Allah. You may believe in Allah, but you just forget Him. You live a life in which never brings Allah to memory, to the forefront of your life. When a person lives like this isn't just white supremacists, Muslims, Shia, any human being. When you turn away from the dhikr, the remembrance of Allah, you would end up living a wretched life. Why? Because if you leave Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would leave you as well. In which state will you be in? Will there be any contentment in the heart? No. So as a result, people fall into this state. And this is one reason as to why individuals become so discontented with their own lives. Because they turn away from the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Second verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here mentions in chapter number 4, Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in verses 78 and 79 that there are people who will be tested by certain things and they will not be able to understand that how life is supposed to be. They will not make sense of the way which the world is supposed to be. And as a result of their inability to make sense of how the world is, they will always be falling. They will always be in a wretched state. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran that when a tragedy befalls you, sometimes we need to understand that it is from us. We are the causes of the tragedies that befall us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in verse number 79, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Ma asabaka min hasanatin famin Allah. Whatever good befalls you, it is from Allah. وَمَا أَصَابَكَ مِنْ سَيِّئَةٍ فَمِنْ نَفْسِكَ. And whatever ill befalls you, it is from your own self. Sometimes I'm the cause of my own downfall. I ended up saying something I shouldn't have because I couldn't control my tongue. I was angry. I lashed out. I drove too fast. I did something. It was me. How then can I blame Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? The second reason people become discontented within their own world is not because Allah leaves them, but because they blame everybody else without realizing that they are the source of their own downfall. Didn't work hard in school, didn't get an education. Now the person from Poland comes across and gets your job. Doesn't have GCSEs, can't speak English, yet you can't get the job. Who's to blame? The Polish person or you without the job? Don't blame the Romanian. Don't blame the Muslim. Don't blame the Syrian. If you didn't work hard in school and you didn't get an education, don't blame the rest of the world when you come out and you can't get a job. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says sometimes the ills come from yourself. The second reason why people become discontented is because they blame everybody else other than actually reflecting upon their own selves, what happens within their life. Third reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, and this is very important. Third reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions as to why people become discontented is because they end up following people and ideologies that are there to manipulate and corrupt them from the very foundation and sources. These individuals are discontented because they're looking for a means, they're looking for an outlet, they're looking for a savior. But because they don't know how to judge between truth and falsehood, they don't know how to judge between what is moral and immoral, any leader that comes in front of them and tells them, follow me, they end up following that person because they don't know how to judge between what is right and what is wrong. There are a plethora of verses Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, but I'll mention to you two and see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes people that are so easily manipulated, that follow any rebellious person that comes in front of their way. As an example, chapter number 22, hours before the referendum was cast, he told the editor, publish the leave one. Imagine thinking that these human beings actually care for you. Imagine being a human being and knowing that after all of these years, 20 years of professionally campaigning to leave the European Union, Nigel Farage got his family German citizenship and passports so they could have access to freedom of movement after the referendum took place. You know all these things. It's in front of you. But people are so easily manipulated. And as human beings, when you end up being like this, you will just blow in any direction and follow whichever thing any human being tells you to follow. Like the paper bag in the gust of the wind. Whichever way the gust of the wind wishes to take you, you will follow. What did the Quran say? Amongst man is he who disputes with Allah without any knowledge. وَيَتَّبِعُ كُلَّ شَيْطَانٍ مَرِيدٍ. And he follows every rebellious person. Anyone who comes up with any ideology, any law, any morality, any theory, any philosophy, in, out, white supremacy this, dictatorship that, human beings are willing to follow it. Why? Because they have lost themselves and they don't know how to be able to navigate these issues. When this happens individually and people stand up, because these individuals, may God help them and bless them, because they are in this way and they're standing on a ledge and they're teetering without any knowledge, without any certainty, any individual can just take them in any which way direction. This was even the case at the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. When people used to bury their daughters alive, they knew it was wrong. But whatever the society was doing, we'll just follow it because that's what society is telling us to do today. If a new, different type of practice came in, the Quraysh would have followed it. If the leadership of the Quraysh had stood up and said, do this, they would have followed it, irrespective of whether it is right or whether it is wrong. One of the great stories, think about these stories and how they relate to today. How beautiful some of these narrations are to give us an insight into the realities of the times in which we live in. One of the stories mentions Qais ibn Asim, very famous story. Qais ibn Asim in the time of Jahiliyyah had buried 12 of his daughters alive. 12 of his daughters alive. He came to the Holy Prophet of Islam and he said to him, Ya Rasulullah, it breaks my heart. I have a story to tell you. He said, go ahead. He said, I buried 12 of my daughters alive. And then one day, I went away for a business trip. And I came back a few years later. And next door neighbors had a child running around. Beautiful daughter. But she really looked like some of my other children previously. And then I began to inquire about this child, and I learned that my wife had given birth to this child of mine whilst I was away on this trip. And in order to save this child from being buried alive, gave it to the neighbors so that this child would grow up. In a fit of rage, I grabbed that child by the arm, dragged her outside into the desert, and I told her to dig. And she began to dig with her small hands. And then I told her to sit, and she sat inside that pit. And then I began to throw that sand and that dirt back upon her until she realized this wasn't a game, and her breath began to give way. And when she began to struggle, I held her down until I covered her and just her hand was showing. Rasulullah was crying listening to this story. Qais bin Asim said, Ya Rasulullah, how do I deal with this? Rasulullah said, your future is very bleak. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I want to repent. What do I need to do? He said, for every daughter you have buried alive, free a slave. Can you see how a human being can easily become discontented and easily manipulated and taken into a mob mentality where they can be made to believe anything? That even though they know something is wrong, they can even bury 13 of their own daughters alive. This is a human situation. This is the way human beings can easily be manipulated. And this is why we see such discontented societies that exist amongst us. Now here, we have to understand that because this bitterness has existed amongst people, because people have been told that they are better than brown people for so long, that their superiority is inherent more than brown people, you can imagine these people that have grown up with these ideas. Previously, they thought their country had an empire over 1/3 of the world. Yesterday, the brown person was serving them. Now, all of a sudden, those very same individuals have entered into their country, have a better education, better jobs, better standards of living. And all along, you have been told by your belief system that you were inherently better. Because you are weak-minded, because you are illiterate, and I don't mean can't read, I mean won't read, because you are a person who is easily manipulated through your anger, when a Nigel Farage or a Boris Johnson or any of these individuals stand up and tell you to think a certain way in order to get out of your poverty, you will rush towards them because you think that they will provide you the sources of your answers. You will not look within yourself. It tells us that we have to manage our own discontents in our life, lest we end up being like these individuals. Now here, we have to understand that these circumstances and these issues that come about, there is a direct relationship here between what we called yesterday latent racism and fascism. And I need to explain the term latent racism in order to be able to understand exactly what we mean by this. We stated yesterday that the theory of race started 4 centuries ago, right? Scientists created this idea to say that races were divided into 2 or 3 or 7, and you are lower and he is higher. And so long as we believe races exist, we are adopting the idea that there is a superior race above an inferior race. And so as long as this exists within society, there will always be latent racism. It will always exist within the structure of society by and large. Fascism, we stated yesterday, was different. What did we say fascism was? Fascism is ultra-nationalism, using violence and hatred to remove anyone else that may differ from you in skin color, in thinking, or in religion, or in sect, and to use the government apparatus to be able to remove them, such as creating an ethno-state. Now this is very important, and I want you to realize that so long as this latent racism exists, people will always be manipulated into having racist tendencies come out. If you have a racist tendency within society, it just needs a Boris Johnson. It just needs a Tommy Robinson. It just needs that type of figure to manipulate, and it will come out because it is latent within the structure of society. When we point and we say, look, fascism exists. Look, it's the EDL. Look, it's the, it's the UKIP, and these people are fascist. And that's a small part of society. We say that. We've not understood the reality of the relationship between Britain and inherent racism. Please listen to the subtlety of this point. This is very important if we're going to help defeat racism in our countries. We say fascism is an extremism, that it exists there in the corners of society, and it comes out in certain times through hatreds, through violence, and so on and so forth. By doing so, by pointing at that extremism only and separating it from mainstream society, we forget how society itself is structured upon racism. We forget that the housing that we have is structured on racism and segregation. Tell me, Grenfell, would Grenfell have happened in another part of London? Or certain parts of London? Would Grenfell have been allowed to have happened in certain parts of London? Why is it that Buckingham Palace has £300 million available from public funds to keep its upkeep, but Grenfell Tower didn't have £12,000 for cladding that would have made it fire resistant. The moment you say racism, we are a progressive society, we are a society that is so welcoming, we're a society that has these modern values, we forget the structure of racism that exists within society, and so long as it exists latently within society, it only requires a person to manipulate it and carry its people with it towards fascism. There is a conveyor belt between racism and fascism. We have to see the relationship between these two things. Now here in Britain, there has always been this racism. And this is important, and I'm not trying to call all Brits or all whites racist. I want you to see what I'm saying. That it's not always about immigration. It is about a structure of believing that there are different countries, and some countries are better than others, and some races are better than others. You know the worst statement? America first. Britain first. My people first. Why? Because my people deserve to be looked after, whilst these people don't deserve to be looked after. Or my people should be looked after first, but these people second. This is racism. It is prejudice. And it comes out in the way in which we understand my country is better. And we have it amongst Muslims, disgustingly. My country is better. Tanzania is better than Kenya. Uganda is worse than Kenya. Iraq is better than Iran. Iran is better than Iraq. Pakistan is better than India. India is better than Pakistan. Nonsense. It is a piece of dirt with fake borders that human beings have drawn up. It has no essential value. The moment you think your people are better than another people by virtue of where you've been born, you have fallen into the trap that the racists have created so that you help perpetuate all of this nonsense. Then how can you defeat racism externally if you have racism internally within your own self? Now, if you've understood this, that these are the ways in which racism exists latently amongst us and it comes out, you would see even in Britain, for example, that these things have existed for a long time. In the 1800s, after the Irish famine, known as the potato famine, many thousands, tens of thousands of Irish moved across towards the west coast of England, settled in Liverpool and all along this part of the country. There was huge racism towards them for being Catholic, for being Irish. The Irish used to be called, listen to this, the Irish used to be called a lower race than the English in the 1800s. So now it's not only brown people have a race and red people have a race and the yellow people have a race. In England in the 1800s, the Irish were considered to be lower because they came from Ireland. You know what? They used to create stereotypes. And they used to say things like, the Irish were drunkards. The Catholics are worse than the Protestants. Do you remember those signs? No Irish, no dogs. Do you remember those signs? Where did this come from? Because people inherently believed that they were better than another group. In the same way, later on, after World War I, when the Jews were scapegoated here. Again, the Jewish immigration to Britain was tiny, minuscule, in the tens of thousands only. But it used to go that so much racism went towards the Jews by the far right, claiming that the Jews were here, they were a, quote, dirty race. They perpetuated certain stereotypes that the Jews were money hungry. Even Shakespeare used to write that the Jews were money hungry in The Merchant of Venice. All of these things used to come out. My point here is what? It didn't matter who it was. It didn't matter if it was immigration or low immigration or big immigration numbers. Even if only 10,000 Jews came to Britain, they were scapegoated, and the whole of a society was told, they are the sources of your problems. The Irish came over, they were scapegoated and told, they are the sources of your problems. In the same way here, in 2019, immigrants and Muslims are scapegoated. So long as latent racism exists within the society, it cannot be gotten rid of. And this is when it ends up becoming fascist and violence and comes out in order to remove these people from society. Here we go into our next topic, our second element of our discussion tonight, and that is to ask, how did the rise of the far right here become mainstreamed? What do we mean mainstreamed? We mean that here in Britain, there are certain structural elements, primarily through government and primarily through the media, that has allowed for the far right to rise and for fascism to come about again. If you do not know how these things exist and where they come from, then you and I will never be in a position to point them out, tell others about them, and be able to defeat them ourselves. As we stated, so long as racism is latent within society, as long as it is hidden and exists within the structures of society, it will always come out, whether it's against the Muslims or the Jews or the Irish or tomorrow, whoever it is going to come out. I'm going to present to you a book, and I'm going to read to you 2 or 3 paragraphs from a book, and I recommend this book to you if you wish to be able to read it, and it is called English Uprising, Brexit and the Mainstreaming of the Far Right by Paul Stoker. I recommend everybody to be able to take time and read this sort of work because it gives you a true understanding of the way in which the far right has been mainstreamed within British society. If we are going to be able to fight the rise of fascism in the West, we need to understand how it has become normalized within the West. It mentions here 2 or 3 stages. And I'm only going to mention brief things because you will understand and join the dots together, inshallah. The far right and the Nazi wishes to create a race war. This is very important. The far right wishes to create a race war because if it cannot force you out through rhetoric, it has always been that fascism has tried to force you out through violence. And so the idea ultimately is to get to a race war where it can blame Muslims for violence, but use violence to be able to say that the Muslims are violent, but use it for its own ends. Now, the way this became mainstreamed and normalized was primarily or firstly under Nick Griffin in our times, in our era. Who is Nick Griffin? Can anyone tell me? Former head of the BNP. Thank you very much. Nick Griffin decided that he would normalize the BNP amongst people, and I want you to know how they do it, if you don't already know. The BNP embarked on a new strategy which sought to moderate their appearance. Previously, they were known as skinheads. Do you remember that? Yeah, the racist would be identified through being skinheads. They moderated their appearance. They were dressed up in suits instead of being skinheads. They moderated their language and the style in which they seemed to legitimize themselves as a political outfit. By softening the BNP party's image, he sought to reach out to disenfranchised working class communities, as well as Middle England. In its own words, the BNP had, quote, broadened and deepened its political platforms, so that today, instead of concentrating on mainly negative issues, it offers the British people a spectrum of policies ranging from all areas of national life, a political spectrum that anyone can buy into. So what's the first thing that the far right does? Normalizes itself through its image and through its policies to try to grab anyone from any spectrum of the political order. So now, what do? They start to focus on certain words. They start to focus on the words freedom, democracy, security, and identity. These 4 areas. And when they can focus and claim that they have an autonomy over these things, that they have the power to decide the meanings, the definitions of identity, the definitions of freedom, then nobody else has any right to be able to talk about their own identity, because British identity has been defined by the BNP. This is the way in which it began to be normalized amongst some people. So previously, they would be called fascists and adopt violence. But now they want to be seen as not being violent themselves, but they want to pose themselves as people who would stand up for the disenfranchised working class. And instead, they would actually state that they stand against politically correct establishments who used to sneer and look down at the ordinary working people. This is how they began to normalize the BNP. Now later, we would actually see that the media has a certain construct. And I want you to note down some of these points, because they're very important for you to be able to express if you're ever talking to non-Muslims or fascist or anything of that nature. In Britain, there is a particular climate of which the newspapers and the media have a certain control on a certain narrative. Do you know who previously was the owner of the Daily Mail? Although we don't call it the Daily Mail, we call it the Daily Hail Hitler, right? Because every day they're really just speaking out of whatever Hitler wanted to say. And I say this not just in joke, but a lot of truth is said in jest. One of the founders or the previous owners of the Daily Mail, another term for it is the Daily Fail as well, amongst you, if you want to use it. An individual by the name of Viscount Rothmere. Viscount Rothmere was actually a person who used to heap praise on Adolf Hitler and lobbied in favor of appeasing the Nazi regime, Weimar Germany, in 1930. The former head of the Daily Mail, was a Nazi apologist. Now later, when the Sun used to be a left-leaning newspaper, and it was bought in the 1970s by a certain Rupert Murdoch, and he immediately turned it over to being a far-right newspaper. And I need you to be able to see how sensationalist these newspapers are in Britain to be able to understand it. Before we get there, even the government later on here became very anti-immigrant. As an example, you may know that Tony Blair's government, the Labour government, put out 6 policies, made it into law, 6 policies to make it more difficult for asylum seekers to be able to claim asylum in the United Kingdom. There was war in Somalia, Yugoslavia had collapsed, there were 17 million refugees and far more of those internally displaced. When they tried to reach Britain, many of them were turned back because of these extra type of governmental rules that were coming in. Now, listen to this about the way in which the media was at that time. A report published by the United Nations magazine called Refugees provided an overview of the anti-asylum, anti-immigrant discourse from the newspapers between January 2000 and January 2006. 6 years. The Sun, the Daily Mail, and the Daily Express published 8,163 articles putting down asylum seekers or immigrants. That's 4 a day. 4 articles a day from these mainstream newspapers were written against immigrants and against asylum seekers coming to the United Kingdom. When people are bombarded with this, it mainstreams, it normalizes the way in which people think about some of these issues. As an example, in 2002, The Sun launched a campaign, the campaign of which was called Stop the Asylum Madness. As an example, the Daily Mail had a headline in 2002 saying, every 6 minutes someone claims asylum here in Britain, and so on and so forth. Look at how manipulated individuals end up becoming. A study in 2002 stated that the people in the UK believed that the UK hosted 23% of the world's asylum seekers. Do you know what the actual figure is, or figure was at that time? 1.98%. This is the way in which people become manipulated. And when the government and when the media normalizes this type of discourse, then it becomes part of the bloodstream of a society itself. The Brexit campaign was this. When UKIP became very powerful, the Conservative Party, the Tory party, was hemorrhaging votes. They were losing people towards the far right. Although in my view, the Conservative Party is a far-right party anyway. It doesn't really have centre-right policies, family policies. It's a far-right party. They were hemorrhaging votes. So in order to try to bring votes back from the far right, what did they do? They created the idea, accepting a referendum on Brexit in the hope that people from the far right would come back towards the Conservative Party. When you've had 10 years of austerity, when you've had 10 years of security issues, terrorism take place in this country, when you've had people grounded to their knees, and we have 14 million people in poverty here in the UK today, 14 million people, and then you ask them, are they happy with the overriding structure of their policy and politics? Of course they're going to vote no. Of course they're going to say, we don't want to exist within the status quo. And this is how far-right movement, hate for immigrants, hate for Muslims has been so normalized both by government and by the media and these lobbies together. The last thing we talk about tonight for these last 5 minutes is an Islamic theory of integration. The first thing we talked about tonight was what? How is it that people become discontented and then get manipulated? The second is how normal the far-right statements are. And then, once we see that there is so much anti-immigration rhetoric, people not wanting to live alongside one another, what does Islam propose? And how did it propose for human beings specifically to integrate with each other? The earliest example of integration comes at the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. When the Muhajirin moved to Medina to live with the Ansar. I'll give you one narration. And I want you to think about this one story and how powerful an example it is about integration in an Islamic worldview. You will remember that the Muhajirin left everything behind, didn't they? They had left their families, they left their houses, they left their wealth, they left their belongings. When they arrived into Medina, the Ansar immediately offered 50% of their wealth to the Muhajirin. I'm asking a question to you. Imagine an immigrant came over, an asylum seeker came over. Be they from Palestine, be they from Iraq, be they from Syria, be they from wherever. How many of us could truly offer 50% of whatever we own immediately to that person in need? You know what the hadith says? That they used to give 50% of their wealth. And then it gets to the point now that the Ansar, who used to have date palms, date trees, they used to have all of this bustan here, they gave half of it away. Listen to this. These are ahadith. See the difference between an Islamic way of living versus the way in which you're told to live here and deal with people from a different part of the world. Initially, they give 50% of everything away. Then when it came to the Ansar and the Muhajirin living together, this hadith says the following. The Ansar and the Muhajirin used to harvest their dates. And so, for example, the Ansar used to put 2 piles of dates, and then they would invite the Muhajirin and would say, take whichever pile you want. And of course, as you know, sometimes some dates are sweeter than the other. Sometimes a pile is bigger than the other. And so the Muhajirin would come and they would pick the smaller amount of dates so that the Ansar would have the larger amount of dates. Because this kept happening, the Ansar decided to play a trick. You know what they did? The hadith says they put stones in the middle of the pile, and then they piled around the stones the dates in order to make it look like their pile was bigger, but really the pile of the Muhajirin would have been bigger. When the Muhajirin learned that they were doing this trick, the Muhajirin used to do the same thing until each group used to offer the other a larger pile, a larger pile, a larger pile. They were doing so much, the Quran mentioned, فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, vie with each other in goodness. It got to the point, listen to this, it got to the point that when the Ansar were dying, they used to give 50% of their inheritance to the Muhajirin as well. They gave 50% of their initial wealth. They would give more from their own bustan. And then when they were dying, they would actually write in their will, my remaining 50% now goes to the Muhajirin as well. Do you know what the hadith and the scholars mention? That the Prophet of Allah came to them and said, you no longer need to do this. They continue to do it. The Prophet again said, you no longer need to do this. They continue to do this. A third time, they continue to do this and give their wealth and wealth and wealth away to the Muhajirin. It returned where Allah had to reveal verses about irth, the laws instituting what you can give and can't give in order to stop the generosity of the Ansar towards the Muhajirin. Allah had to bring law, ahkam, fiqh, in order to stop people being so generous to one another. This is the Islamic worldview. That we're supposed to help one another towards God. We're supposed to get the best out of one another. I see you in a state of distress and weakness. I bring you towards strength and the fore of your completion. I don't look at you in a state of your weakness and put you down, send you out, send you back. My arm is extended to you. And this is how we learn to integrate with one another. Can you imagine how much the Muhajirin did for the Ansar when the Ansar were treating the Muhajirin in this way? This is the way in which Islam wants us to deal with each other. Not through hatred, not through reviling one another, not through putting one another down, but understanding the realities of how we are. Tomorrow, we will talk about this question. How do you speak to a fascist? If you debate, if you talk, if you sit for lunch, if you go on the radio, how do you present yourself? And what are the specific arguments that we need to present? And then in our last discussion, the following night, inshallah, we will look at specific tools that Islam uses to be able to bring the hearts of the far right towards us. Inshallah, tonight we have discussed these three elements of how discontent comes about how the far right has been mainstreamed, and the Islamic view of how we integrate with one another through love and doing good to one another. Inshallah, this is of value and we can learn how to be Muslims as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has expected us to be. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.